Good afternoon. All right. Good to see all of you here. It's good to be reunited at the ASA and to see new faces as well. My name is Abosade George, and I am the incoming co-convener for the Women's Caucus. And I am very proud and ecstatic to introduce our Women's Caucus Luncheon speaker for 2024. Our luncheon speaker for 2024 is Professor Naminata Diabate. Some of you might have seen her name floating around online. She is one of the 10 African scholars to watch in 2024, according to the Africa Report. And I'm going to talk about her other accolades as well, but this one stuck out to me because of the way that it speaks to the visibility of an African women's scholarship, feminist scholarship being done today to a broader audience. And one of the challenges I think that we face is that despite the brilliance of the work of all the people in this room, it's not always clear that a broader audience, and particularly a broader audience in the African continent, is aware of what we're doing. So it's really very exciting to see. It was very exciting for me to see the name of Professor Diabate on this list. So let's give her a hand for breaking that barrier between the academy and the community. Professor Naminata Diabate is an associate professor of comparative literature at Cornell University. She is also a member of the advisory board of the Africa Institute in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, an emerging, powerful institution. She's a scholar of gender, sexuality, race, biopolitics, and neoliberalism, with linguistic expertise in Malinke, French, English, Nuchi, Spanish, and Latin. She can basically speak to anyone in this room in the language of their soul. Her work seeks to redefine how we understand forms of embodied agency in global Africa and beyond. Most of you will know her prize-winning book, Naked Agency, Genital Cursing and Biopolitics in Africa, which came out with Duke in 2020. It won several prizes, including the African Studies Association Best Book Prize for 2021, the African Literature Association First Book Award in 2022, among others. She continues to be very research active and is now working on a new book called Pleasure and Displeasure in Global Africa. I'm so excited about that. That's all I do all day. I'm pleased and I'm displeased. She's also working on 2 projects, a monograph on digital insurgencies and bodies, and an edited volume with Olufemi Taiwo called The Mansa Musa Syndrome. What does that mean? Maybe we'll hear more about these projects this afternoon. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Professor Naminata Diabate.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. Thank you so much, Professor George, for this humbling introduction. And I also would like to express my deepest gratitude to you and to the Women's Caucus officers for inviting me to be its 33rd speaker. It's really an honor to be part of an institution That started 34 years ago. So I'm honored to be standing on the shoulders of giants. If I'm just a shadow of what they have accomplished in the US Academy, in the European Academy, and in Africa and the world, I will be the best. So thank you. And to you, the audience, thank you for spending part of your afternoon with me. I hope that whatever I'm going to share will be worth your time. But I know you're also here for the food and the awards. Now that I have addressed the most important part of my time here, my gratitude, let me move to the most tedious part, my lecture. In alignment with this ASA theme, Global Africa, the goal of my reflection is twofold: epistemological and ethical. Actually, I don't like big words such as epistemological, but here it's just a shortcut, because I don't have the time to really expand on it, so I'm just using that term. First, I would like to bring attention and analyze a putatively secret practice, labia minora elongation, that the digitalization of life has globalized and amplified. And two, I would like to invite us to rethink our intellectual project and methodologies about girlhood and personhood to contribute even more profoundly to the global marketplace of ideas. But before I expand on how to imagine ways of engaging elongation, which I'm going to be referring to in the remainder of the paper as LME, and this is a methodological approach, let me sketch out its broader contours, meaning its visibility or iceberg visibility, its scope, and the rationale behind it. So, visibility, scope, and definition. Once discussed solely in scholarly publication, the World Health Organization statements, now with the robust advance of digital media democratization and penetration, the practice has received renewed attention and enjoyed greater visibility. Content creation and distribution via TikTok, WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and related sites have inspired news report, short and feature documentary films, video reportage, and activist work, behooving as scholars and academics and intellectuals to rethink it at the nexus of girlhood, community, and personhood. In relation to international visibility, the practice was mentioned in 19th century colonialist writings, but these were mostly done in Latin. I had a chart which illustrated how the practice had accrued attention over time. Until 1957, discussion or mention of LME was scanty. Whereas the 1960s saw two publications, you can see the chart. The 1970s registers 3 articles. However, incrementally, LME gathered attention in the 1980s and 90s, reaching an exponential peak in the 2000s. I have identified 4 factors undergirding that development: the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the WHO classification, the significant rise of women's and gender and sexuality studies, and finally, information technologies' greater availability and sophistication. Regarding scope, LME, also known as labial pulling and stretching, is reportedly practiced within communities in more than 15 African countries and in the diasporas in Europe and North America. The digital has amplified that globality to a different stratosphere as the frontiers of the imaginary are continuously expanding. In the last 4 decades, social scientists have relied chiefly on ethnography to advance more than 15 reasons behind the practice, including achieving normative womanhood, signaling marriage readiness, improving marriageability, pleasuring future husbands, preventing marital infidelity, securing successful marriage, promoting sexual desire, facilitating and enhancing female pleasure, respecting and upholding cultural and traditional mores, avoiding ridicule and castigation by other women, preventing female dryness and coldness, easing childbirth, averting infertility, preventing diseases, and finally showing modesty. Some of these reasons were provided by the 1980s and 1990s studies that responded to the growing concerns about the HIV/AIDS pandemic. However, researchers did not find evidence of a direct correlation between HIV infection and LME, leaving the practice in relative obscurity. However, that status changed with the 1996 publication of the World Health Organization classification of what they termed female genital mutilation. The first of its kind, the typology of 4 categories, which included LME as a form of FGM, sought to increase data collection through ease of identification and ensure the comparability of data sets. News of the report's inclusion of LME led scholars to rush to the field, so to speak. From medicine, medical and cultural anthropology, sociology, psychology, linguistic, and political science, researchers interviewed, collected, analyzed, and published a wide range of reflections, some of them uncontroversial and others condemning the WHO. Thus, the 2000s registered the most publications on LME with more than 24. These numbers correlate with Google Ngram's finding. That is the next slide. As we all know, Google Ngram is not a finite science, but this is the indication that mentions and discussion of this practice receive more attention in scholarly books. That means that collections of books, collections of essays. Based on semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and participant observations, these essays diverge into 2 broad camps: proponents and opponents of the WHO classification. Whereas proponents strike LME, highlighting the lack of scientific basis for it, and foregrounding its traumatic effect on victimized girls and women, advocates of declassification offer 5 justifications. As you can notice, I'm not naming names here, because some of the lecturers who participated in this very forum provided justification for declassification. And again, this is a methodological approach that we can discuss. Is it useful to name names, especially if these are scholars that you respected? Okay. 5 reasons. 1, participants because with the interviews, focus groups, participants celebrates the practice for its pleasurable benefits in their lives and for their male sexual partners. 2, the practice is a cultural traditional institution. 3, LME does not cause feelings of incompleteness, anxiety, and depression, close quote. The WHO should list as harmful cultural practices procedures such as clitoral piercing performed in Western countries. By labeling these African cultural practice of sexual enhancement as a harmful practice, the WHO violates the right of women and children, close quote, that fifth rationale. As criticism mounted in the early 2000s, the WHO 2008 interagency statement published an updated typology, which removed LME from its list, with severe implications for individuals who seek treatment from medical personnel for their deformed body parts. Testimonies and activist materials suggest that trend. Although criticisms of the WHO classification subsided after the modified typology, enduring concerns about HIV/AIDS, the rise of sexuality studies and new media have continued to strengthen the remarkable awareness of LME. Mediality and digitality are potent instruments for three reasons. One, the capacity to evoke powerful emotions. Two, their portability, as they inherently reach larger audiences with superior ease and access. And three, their diverse types of appearance and access through mobile phones, tablets, laptops, desktop computers, and TV monitors. Probably right now, some of us are on some kind of screens, just like I am, leading to the digitalization of life. As the capacity to escape the hypervisibility of LME for some of us who work at the intersection of women and girls in Africa and digital media, as we are getting more and more challenged to confront this practice, I ask, how might one contribute to a conversation that has so far been celebratory and denunciatory? So I invite us, as I invited myself, to reorient the terms of a debate into questions of methods, and relatedly, into the conceptual terrain of personhood and ethics. So it's in writing the book on pleasure and displeasure that I had to write about this subject matter. During my whole time here in the US Academy, I came here for graduate school, I never wanted to talk about FGM or FGC because it's such a controversial subject. So when I decided, or when I was, decided to work on pleasure, that book became about displeasure. So now I had to include the concept of displeasure because that book is so painful. Some chapters took me months to write for a variety of reasons. That probably the preface of the book, has laid out. So, what kind of methods did I have to come up with in order to write about subjects that I don't want to write about? So, the questions that I have, what kinds of methods my researchers devise to determine the hierarchy of goals and commitments? How might one theorize the confluence of multiple and competing factors? So far, I have identified 8 considerations that have to do with the scholar, the young girls who are impacted or may be impacted by LME, the African state, transnational institutions such as the WHO, and transnational institutions such as the WHO. This configuration of factors combines to impact the kind of insight that may emerge from studying LME. So the methodological schema that works by ranking priorities. For example, for the scholar, what is the scholar's belief in, respect for, and commitment to the sanctity of the cultures and traditions? What is important to them, the intellectual project or the professional pressure, or the professional pressures or aspirations? What are the prevailing theoretical and political framework? Currently, we have decolonizing and decoloniality. what is important? The personhood and rights of the girls who may undergo, who have undergone the practice, is writing back to the West and its tentacles, such as international health institutions that are staffed both by Africans and non-Africans, and that are perceived, rightly so sometimes, to be perpetuating long-standing racist tropes. How do we think about the after effects of historical injuries such as the transatlantic slave trade and colonization that have perpetuated racist tropes about, black bodies? What about the African states with its failures and strengths and weaknesses? For example, how does the researcher think about the African state that sometimes have laws on their books that could protect these young girls, but fail to do that? And the researchers understanding that these laws have actually been dictated by the West. So these are competing factors. So the point that I'm trying to make, once we list these competing factors, then the scholars can understand, where does my priorities lie? Where does my priority lie? Then based on that, take an approach. Because when I started the project, I just didn't know where my priorities, were at. So I just couldn't find the angle. But once I ranked them, I knew, and I stood by it. And as you will say in the paper, I stood by the girls, probably against the larger theoretical framework, decolonization. I stood against, I'm a Malenke from Côte d'Ivoire, where it's not practiced, not to my knowledge, but if it were practiced, I would have stood against it, even it's in my culture. So I had to identify what my priority was, even against institutions and bodies that I would have aligned with. So, for instance, by adopting a schema that privileges the personhood and rights of girls, the scholar might seek to access through mediated genre the inner lives of girls, especially the girls who reject or have suffered from the practice. Thus, rather than focus on the women who speak positively of the practice, as social scientists have tended to do, how about those participants who do not promote those opinions? Might not a balanced account of this bodily and sexual practice take seriously the outliers? Here, I privilege mediated genre for ethical issues concerning fieldwork with children. This orientation is also a call to take philosophical and aesthetic disciplines seriously. Note that Africa has been the land of data and ethnography. Let's rethink that emphasis by looking at speculation as a robust interpretive model. Additionally, writing back to the West instead of focusing on the girl who may be coerced into the practice leads to a faulty comparative approach between cosmetic procedures such as clitoral piercing, labiaplasty, clitoral hood reduction, and LME. Two major factors, the age of the concerned girls and women, and the importance placed on the specific body modification, makes the comparison unhelpful. Whereas LME aims at prepubescent girls, genital plastic surgery procedures are the prerogative of adults, at least in the law. Underage girls will not typically qualify for these surgeries unless they are for medical reasons. Second, if these cosmetic procedures in the West are determined on an individual basis and entail no overt social and communal pressures, that is not the case with LME, which almost takes on a collective tone. That quasi-culturally sanctioned practice led Josephine Larson to title a 2010 essay called The Social Vagina, Labial Elongation and Social Capital Among Women in Rwanda. Although men in communities where the practice is required are safe from knowing about it, various other groups with varying degrees of influence, such as paternal aunts, grandmothers, mothers, older sisters, and peers, are the prominent enforcing actors. Several documentary films and news reports have identified schools as the principal sites of preaching and teaching LME. And some schools, some parents are even threatened to take their children out of some schools because the schools took a stand and say, we are not going to preach and coerce the girls to practice this form. These figures and institutions invite, encourage, or coerce, whatever the case, the girls to perform LME. Failing the practice or coming short of reaching the desired length, the girls suffer chastisement, are stigmatized as inadequate, or suffer ridicule, and a host of other repercussions. These collective enforcement strategies constitute an assault on the concerned girls and women's personhood and their right to their bodily integrity. In elaborating on the notion of personhood, I pose the following questions. How is the personhood of minors conceived in contexts where their genitalia are deformed in irreversible ways for a future-oriented purpose and conformity to so-called cultures and traditions? Might there be a form of perversity in sexualizing young girls? And lastly, how might one understand the relationship between LME and pleasure? Attempting to answer these questions leads one to uncomfortable answers. The practice of elderly women asking prepubescent girls to open their legs so that they can pull their parts for a prospective objective is perverse. In what follows, I formulate my account of perversity. It is perverse to deny the girls the protection and privacy to which they are entitled, to disallow the girls the right to make informed decisions when the appropriate time comes, to deform in irreversible ways the anatomy of for a future over which no one or institution should exercise the capacity to deliberate, to fail to consider the girl's eventual matrimonial choice, whether they will be sexual or asexual, to determine with certainty that marriage as a social contract will determine the quality of an individual's life, to disregard the feelings and views of girls who express rebellion and pain, to compromise innocence through sexualization, to guarantee the girl's pleasure primarily if that pleasure hinges on an external factor, such as a male person's capacity and willingness to play with the disfigured anatomy, to subsume the girl's future needs under the community's demands, and finally, to ignore scientific and medical developments that have shown that LME does not necessarily translate into enhanced stimulation and satisfaction. Young girls are perhaps one of the most vulnerable social categories, and their well-being and safety should be exercised by individual communities and institutions. Actually, a community should be judged based on how it handles its dissenters and its most vulnerables. Let me note that activists who militate to present LME do so on accounts of preserving tradition and culture. Indeed, a case should be made between concession LME by adults and the indoctrination and violation of young girls. What is this culture that seems frozen in time? What is a tradition that is not granted the privilege of incorporating and benefiting from change, especially concerning protecting its people? What ought to happen to a cultural practice that no longer adequately serves the needs or reflect the aspiration of its people? My point is not a wholesale rejection of all cultures. Sensible cultural practices should be preserved and even amplified, but not at the expense of other people's freedom. So I close with the ethical question. What kind of knowledge might we produce if protecting cultural traditions and or responding to the wrongs perpetuated by the West are not the driving forces? What type of knowledge might we contribute to the marketplace of ideas if we reorient our perspectives toward the girls who have been or may be negatively impacted by LME? Thanks to or because of the power and reach of digital media, scholars are increasingly called on to confront certain practices. LME is one such question. In entering these debates, either willingly or otherwise, as was my case, we may encounter figures whose narratives do not comfort us in our supposed Africanness and our notions of culture. Taking these figures seriously enables us to provide a deeper understanding of the limits of specific practices, not African practices, but human practices. From my proposal, I hope emerge methodological and ethical questions that we may confront in advocating for political project and theoretical interventions. Imperatives that today, more than ever, are intertwined. Thank you.